My name is Chris Leonard. I am one of the co-organizers of the Austin Python Meetup. Been doing Python professionally for about 6 years. Do a lot of consulting work. I'm doing some consulting work now. I chose to demo HTMX, which is not really Python at all. It's a JavaScript package that allows you to execute interactivity in a web browser without having to write all the JavaScript by hand. The reason I chose this is basically for myself. I have a deep web background. I've been writing JavaScript of some sort for many, many years, but I never really mastered JavaScript as a language. A lot of the frameworks make it really easy to do stuff on the page without really knowing the lower level language. And for those of us who are working on models or algorithms or anything that we need to get out of a Jupyter notebook or off of our laptop out into the world, this allows you to take a basic web app framework like Flask, which is what I'm using, and add the interactivity so that you get an elegant user experience without having to spend 2/3 of your time hacking. If you're like me and don't really know JavaScript, you know, if I'm doing one of those apps, I spend 2/3 of my time hacking the JavaScript and not focusing on the core functionality of the app. So HTMX, basically it allows you to define what you want JavaScript to do in HTML attributes. And this is a simple example from the htmx.org website. You can see a button here. HX post means it's going to make a post request to that URL, and it's going to swap the outer HTML of whatever the response from the server is. It's going to replace that whole button with whatever comes from the server. So on the server, instead of sending JSON into the client and then programming the client to do something with it, you're sending back fragments of HTML that get put into the page however you define it. It's actually, I got into it thinking, oh, this is going to be easy. One of those classic mistakes we all make. I'll say this from the beginning. This is not a complete replacement for JavaScript in that you kind of have to understand the role that JavaScript plays in web development. If you don't understand what AJAX means, which is how the client communicates back to the server without having to reload the page, then it's going to be hard for you to execute that kind of functionality even with HTML attributes. So you kind of have to understand what DOM manipulation is, what AJAX is, what WebSockets are. But as long as you understand basically what those are, it's much easier to implement like this. And so I built a really super cool little microblog to sort of demonstrate some of this stuff in my own code. And I just want to check that I can pull up my editor. I can. Okay. So when I load this page, it makes a full request back to the server to bring up the whole page. I've already, there's a database behind it with my little fake tweets. And I'm using Faker for anybody who knows what that is to generate fake text. If I want to add a new post, so immediately it did two things. One, it went back to the server and it saved it in the database. And then it appended it to my list, just like Twitter does. And it did all of that in, X, sorry. Let's call it Elon Bill, just to clear that up. So that simple little interaction really took not much more than a few attributes on the form object, which is in home. So this is the basic fragment that gets loaded onto the home page, and this is how the form is defined. You can see here that I'm grabbing the posts that are already in the database when the page loads, and then this right here is what controls that entire interaction. Is this legible to everybody in the room? How about that? Okay, so I gave it an ID, post control form. HX post basically does a couple things. It overwrites whatever the default of the object is. And it explicitly says that this is going to be a post request, and you give it an endpoint that you define in your routing to tell it where to go. And then HX target says the response, I want to do something with it on the page, and that target is this post listing, which contains a list of article elements, one for each post. So I'm telling it that whatever comes back from the server, which we'll look at it in a second, needs to go there, and then the swap defines how it gets applied. We'll look at the documentation in a minute, but you could replace an entire element or just the inner HTML of an element. In this case, I'm saying after begin. So what I'm telling it is I want this appended after the beginning of the element. And since it's a wrapper div with article elements, and what I'm sending back from the server is another article element, it's going to append it at the top, which is what we want. And as you can see, if I reload this, my post is still there because now I'm reading from the database. So it posted it to the database, added it to my page, just like what happens in Facebook and Twitter and all that, where the page isn't reloading, it's interacting with the server to get its data. The last thing I wanted to do is clean the form. So when you interrupt a form's natural functionality, so by default, a form is going to post back to the server and reload the entire page. We don't want to do that. We don't want to reload this whole page and read all of the content from the database again. We just want to update what's there. To clean out the form, I defined a really super complicated JavaScript function that just simply resets the form as if it had one of those old school reset buttons that used to be on every form, for anybody who's been around long enough to see that. So HX on basically says, I want to write a callback around an event of some sort. And then after request just says, after the whole thing is done, then do whatever this says. And I'm calling my reset form, which is defined here. And then we go down to the bottom. I'm calling my custom JavaScript file before I bring in HTMX, which I'm loading from a CDN. So that is what is necessary to reset the form. And I really wanted that so that you didn't have to clear out the form yourself. So this basic little bit of attributes replaces, who writes JavaScript? How many lines of JavaScript? Let's say you're doing jQuery with Ajax. That's not that bad, but let's say you had to do this 20 times in the same app and each one was a little bit different. That's where this begins to save you some time. Okay.
So does the reset form also run like, that's just a client side thing. Like where's the distinguish, like where does it go? Where is the server side? What's running server side and what's running client side? Like how to specify which is what? Because I imagine the reset form is not like a server side.
No. That is a way to hook custom JavaScript into the current context given the event handler, right? So the point is that with these attributes, you can only define one action, right? I want to post the contents of this form to the post endpoint, and then I want to do something with the response, and that's what the next two are. That's literally for calling JavaScript. And
so it's after request, so like you've already requested your server.
So the others are already done. It's gone to the server with the data from the form. In Flask, I grab that data and I save a new post model instance to my database, just a little local SQLite. And then after all of that is done, so this line doesn't really even care what the other ones are doing. It's just saying after whatever else is going on is done, then do this last thing. You can also do before request. And I started to try to get into, some cool visual animations and stuff. What you could do is
some live coding would be a bit dangerous.
well, let's say that something else does like a clever animation. It makes Jacob's face pop up and say, good job, and then go away. which is something I'm going to get on just any day now. So you could write top-level functions that contain other functions to do more than just one thing. But that's the hook mechanism basically says, after all this other stuff that HTMX was intended to do is done, now do this other thing.
So your reset form is defined.
Yes, if I undo my live code, well, I don't need to do that. Right, so because this is defined in JavaScript, it's included at the top level of my document. It's defined, so in the JavaScript namespace or whatever you call it, it knows to go find that function, run whatever it does. It could be an AJAX call. You could hit something else on the server and update the database with something more complex than what's in that form or whatever. But I thought it was important to demonstrate something more than just the basics of this, which is why, and I really wanted the form to reset without creating a reset button.
So what about the swap? The swap is client side, or is that?
No, that's client side, right? So HX target says whatever comes back from the server, here's where I want it to act on this element. Swap just basically defines how it's going to affect that element. Again, you could replace the entire element with the contents from the server. You could stick it at the end. You could replace just the inner HTML. So you could pull a whole new list of posts and put those in, replace what's inside of that element. It's actually really powerful.
So when you're posting, you said that you're getting HTML back. Is it HTML coming back, or is it possible to return JSON?
You could return JSON, and you would need to write more JavaScript to handle it, unless you wanted to display JSON in a pre-element or something like that, which you could do.
So you would get JSON in response, and you have to then call something kind of like your reset form, where it takes like JSON, put it in the page somewhere, formats it, puts it.
Right. So are you familiar with Jinja or any sort of templating? Okay. So let's take a look at this. Is there anybody in here who is a Python practitioner? Anybody who's not a Python practitioner does not know what I'm talking about, unless you write web apps in some other language. Does anybody not understand basic templating in a web app framework? So basically you have like my base, which is the outer HTML, and then I define this block content, which gets replaced by home.html, and that's what's called by my home endpoint. And so this, which is the form and the list of posts, gets inserted into the base. It does so by basically saying I'm extending the base template. So when you call this, it grabs the base and it sticks this in there. When we're dealing with server responses with this, what we want are, in Rails, they're called partials. I'm calling them fragments to differentiate from partials that are part of the compiling process. This is a separate use case, so I'll call them fragments. And this is what the post looks like. And so I can call in Flask render template. I don't have to return the template. I can render it out and then return that string, but it's not a full page response, right? Because you've interrupted the whole server flow of going back to bring back the whole web page. This is a tiny little request that gets this tiny fragment that's populated, as you understand, with the post author handle as a property that I wrote just to turn the name into a Twitter handle for demo purposes. Created. Oh, that's the November 9th. It's under the hood. It's formatted with string f time, and then there's the content. So basically, what I'm doing in my routes. So for anybody who doesn't know, routing is how you tell a web app framework, given this URL, go do this stuff. So this says when I'm at the root URL, which is the home page, it gives it a page title, it grabs all the posts in the database, and then it renders the home template. Ignore that. So this is the endpoint that gets called from HTMX. So when I submit the form, and again, that right there, /post, corresponds with that right there. Okay, so anytime you call server/post with a post type request, it's going to run this code. So it grabs the content from the form, creates a fake author, creates the post object, saves it to the database. Then using that post, it renders the fragment, which again is this guy here. So it puts all the post stuff. And this fragment is what gets sent back to the server. And because I've said that I want it to affect that div by inserting it at the beginning, that's how it does what it does. George.
So can you put a data model for like your post like parameters, like in this HTMX?
What do you mean a data model?
Like I want to make sure that I have these fields, like post my endpoint, you know, how say posting like certain things to your endpoint. Say I want on actual author. Like if you have more than just one blob of text, you have like an author, a post, maybe some other third thing. Like how would you make sure that you have those like for data validation?
Oh, you could write.
Like, but is that supported in the HTMX or it's just gonna like post?
I don't know that there's explicit validation in HTMX itself. You know, HTML has a lot of.
Can you scroll to the button or like
To the what?
Where you make the post request in this HTMX?
Uh-huh.
So and your target is this hashtag listening. Oh no, it's the ID. So like, what are you posting here is just from the form?
Yes.
Like, how do you literally target is that for post listing? So could it be multiple things? Could you have like multiple targets and like single button? Like I put the button and two text bugs come through?
That I don't know you could do. But that's where it's extensible with JavaScript. And, you know, you could make this form as complex as you wanted to, right? You could have the form call Ajax stuff like, when I select this author, populate this drop down with these things. You know, there's all sorts of stuff you could do. This is a really simplistic thing. And I've thought about more complex scenarios like that. And that's where just having worked with event callbacks in a lot of contexts, I was like, I wonder if there's a before and after, and sure enough, I found it. By the way, for anybody who is empathetic to people like me struggling, this syntax is very, it's kind of finicky. And so if you accidentally spend a half an hour to figure out that you're missing one colon because it takes two, then that's a half hour you're never going to get back. It kind of just doesn't do anything.
Do you get like a console, something back in the
I didn't see anything. I had something much more complex in mind, and I woke up this morning and I'm like, I'm not going to finish that today. So I threw it away and built this. No. He was asking if you could have like multiple targets or do more with just one request in HTMX itself.
That was also interesting, like, you know, will be the difference, like, if you don't have that extra colon, we interpret it as something else or something.
Oh, no, it's this syntax for HTML, because HX on is meant to handle events, it has to be followed by two colons and then the name of the event that you want to hook into. That's just the syntax they picked, and I typed it wrong and I paid the price for it. As far as whether you can do more complex stuff, you know, for me I've done really, being a JavaScript, more dangerous than beneficial. I've still, in jQuery, written some really pretty sophisticated interfaces, and I have the same question. I haven't quite figured out if you wanted to push one button and do three things exactly how you do that. But with these callbacks, you can do a before, an after, and then you have JavaScript. Yeah. It's name spacing. That's it.
Does this form still work with so it's a very Flask specific thing? Does it work with what forms or no?
I am not using the form middleware. I use it in traditional monolithic. I'm a big fan of the traditional Flask stack. Although I couldn't get Flask assets to work with Flask 3.0, and I didn't feel like messing with it.
I guess, yeah, just one of George's questions was like validation, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
I
yeah.
know, like, what form's gonna validate.
You're right. But what the form does is it ensures that the markup, I think there's a required attribute you can put in there, and there's a lot you can do in HTML without JavaScript to validate forms. Like if you choose the email type, it's gonna want what it considers to be a valid email. In this case, you could fork this logic and have it, pop up something that says, hey, you're missing a piece of data, if you wanted to go that route. So there is some flexibility there, but I just created the simplest explanation because I figured there'd be more value in the questions than me taking 45 minutes to show what I built.
You happen to know if the HTMX on event was created in C++ or?
Oh, no.
Chris,
This is
can
just-
you repeat the question for the recording?
He's asking how HX on was implemented, if it was in C++ or something. To my knowledge, this is all a JavaScript package. So that right there calls it from a CDN. And let's look at it. How are we doing on time? Yeah, so it's just JavaScript. There's no binary information in there. Now,
I have a question, Chris. I'm going to grab you back to Python because this is what I understand. So why does HTMX help me with Python? I see that you have a Python app there, but what couldn't I do if I didn't have this HTMX thing? Or what would be hard for me?
if you don't know JavaScript, this is written as a single page app, right? The alternative would be to submit the form back to the server and get a full page response. So the whole point is that I can make this a little more interactive, a little bit more of a single page application. I can do things, you can implement WebSockets. You can, create a data pipeline back to the server, and just like when LinkedIn tells you you got a new message, or Facebook tells you you got a new post or something, you can do all that stuff with this. So it's really just a quick way of building a modern interface without having to write all the JavaScript itself.
Okay, so basically I can do everything like in one page that in the past would take me like several rerouts and things and several pages. Now I can make it much easier without complication. Did I get it right?
No, close enough.
Okay.
I would call it a more elegant solution. You could easily have this work, like I said, like an old school website where it just posts the whole thing to the server and gets back a full response, but then you're reading from the database unnecessarily. Right, and he just brought up a good point. These client-side callbacks allow us to do more than what HTML, even with a Python backup, is capable, and you do it in the client.
So if I'm a Python guy, when should I use it and when should I ignore it?
I would use it if you needed to get something out the door. Let's say you trained a model and you wanted to build an inference engine that you sent around to friends to test your model. You could load that up in a Flask app and stick it on Heroku or EC2 or whatever, and have it sent out, in a few hours, without somebody having to understand Torch or whatever you're using to train your model. That's what I would use it for. So if you're doing the kind of data science-y algorithm, probably not a huge, large language model, but like basic model, I would think some basic computer vision stuff would be really easy to do with an upload form. That's what I would use it for. That's the whole point. I mean, you know me pretty well in what I do. So going back to I used to have a startup, and it was linguistic analysis. So the stuff that you've seen, think about how much quicker that would be if I didn't have those things that you've seen that I did when I was at Capital Factory. 2/3 of that time was spent writing jQuery instead of, the algorithmic logic, design. And so all of that work I did for the startup would have been incredibly faster if I'd had this instead of having to write all the jQuery by hand.
So you recommend basically Python programmers who want to focus on the Python and less about the, front-end development of JavaScript to use this because it will make shortcuts for them. Did I summarize it correctly now?
That's better.
Okay, thank you, because this is what I want people to get out of this. Thank you.
Okay. One more little thing here, which I put this little button down at the bottom of the page. There's another H on, click, and instead of calling a function, I just have hard-coded an alert message, which anybody who's written JavaScript will know what that means. And so I can interact with the basic browser stuff. You can write confirmations. There's all sorts of stuff you can do to hook into JavaScript, either just hard coding it or build a library of functions that are calling other functions. It gets the possibilities of it get really exciting as you start to think about all the ways that you could tie this stuff together.
How much do you see this as a replacement for jQuery or React? And how well do you see things like that coexisting?
The question he asked is the degree to which this would replace a jQuery and or React and whether or not they can go to this. That's an excellent question. I love jQuery. I like I wouldn't call it, whatever that model, I was starting to say object-oriented, it really isn't, but whatever that model is, I like it. You could probably use jQuery and HTMX next to one another. There's also, for anybody interested, there's a website called You Might Not Need jQuery, and it tells you how to do a lot of basic jQuery stuff in vanilla JavaScript. And so if you were going into prod and you wanted to keep this, they make a claim at the top of this page. HTMX is small, about 14K gzipped, dependency free, blah, 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 and has reduced code sizes by 67% when compared with React. So having done, I had a full-time gig where I was doing full stack work with Python and GraphQL and React. And my opinion on React, it might not be proper, is that it's a wonderful framework if you need that kind of complexity. Most people who are using it, in my opinion, don't really need it because there's not enough going on in their interface. There's lots of ways to approach the single page application model. I could see doing HTMX and jQuery next to one another, and probably it's not going to cause, again, I'm not a JavaScript expert. If you use, one of the little, I have a browser extension that'll tell me what something is built in as best it can figure it out. And sometimes you'll see like 10 different JavaScript packages, right? And there's people out there who are very lazily throwing all sorts of crap into the client that just makes it bloated, that fast, it doesn't scroll fast. I like to keep things minimal. My approach would be to write HTMX and then use something like, you might not need jQuery to do the basics of what jQuery does without jQuery. Takes a little bit more writing, but all of the examples you can copy and paste. So I don't know the answer to that. Again, I love jQuery, and I would like to use this and jQuery next to one another because think about writing, if you've written an Ajax, with the error handling and what to do with the success and all, and then, you get this pile of JSON data and then you have to tell it where to put everything, that replaces all that. So, would I maybe use jQuery for some DOM manipulations or effects that are easier to do than they are in vanilla JS? Absolutely. But that's just my opinion, and I'm not enough of a JavaScript expert to give an expert an opinion. It wouldn't bother me if I saw this and jQuery next to one another. I probably wouldn't get into like Vue or something like that. Anything Reactish is like a whole framework that takes over your whole front end, I probably wouldn't do, but something like jQuery where you can use JavaScript for what it was intended to, which is light interaction on a page that's already rendered, write that in JavaScript and use this for all the heavy lifting. Here and then here.
Have you noticed, writing your own code instead of using jQuery that, your own code can be just as efficient and like, there's not like any like interaction or like glitches or anything that comes up?
No, because most of it's jQuery stuff. I mean, you're selecting elements based on an ID, the name of the tag, a class name or whatever, and then you're doing something with them, changing their content or moving them around on a page or changing something's colors, fading something in or out. All that's fairly easy to do in Vanilla.js. It might be a few more lines of code, but efficiency-wise, I don't think it would. Again, I'm not a JavaScript expert, but I can't imagine it being, none of this stuff is, real heavy-duty stuff. So I think as long as you kept it light, and, I kind of think that people are trying to put too much responsibility in the client these days, like way too much, where you have these huge bloated interfaces. But that's just my opinion. Did that answer your question? I feel like I ran.
Oh, yeah, I know.
Okay.
Besides forums and buttons, as we showed, what other HTML elements you can manipulate?
So by default, it's going to want to put it, once you include HTMX on the page, it's going to want to intercept form requests as post requests. Any sort of link is going to be a GET request. You can overwrite, and then of course there's elements like paragraphs that don't have any kind of action attributed to them by the web browser. You can say, when I click on this paragraph, delete everything on the page. You can define any HTTP verb on any element on the page. And so if you want to break out of forms do posting and links do getting, you can do that.
Can you do multiple things with one element? Like, can you have two callbacks on the same element?
I think you can. So
is there any sort of like, can you not do a DAG? Like, can you have can you make a feedback loop like
that? I don't know. I mean,
is it protected?
there's a before and there's an after.
Like, can I change an element and then have another one run and then it just like, feedbacks itself? I guess that's.
I mean, if you're asking like, is there a possibility of like bad feedback? I don't know the answer. There's a before request and an after request. You can hook into JavaScript and do anything with those that you want to. A simple alert, a function that calls a bunch of other functions. So I haven't gone far enough down the rabbit hole to, if that's possible, I'll find it eventually. I promise you that.
Yeah, I'd add this to Jacob though, is that even, and Jacob's point of what it could do is like, even I said I used Dash and stuff, and all the client-side callbacks, you have to write them in JavaScript anyway.
Mhm.
So, like, even if you're using these other, visual tools, I bet you Vizu, haven't seen that yet, but I did a little bit of Streamlit. I bet you the client-side callbacks, you all have to write those JavaScripts. Interacting with your browser, very few things. I think there are a few things. I think you can get the layered box, but other things in your browser, you have to write that JavaScript anyway. So
I think it would be interesting to see what kind of trouble you could get into with this technology and what was in the previous presentation. Yeah. Like as I was watching his, I was like, what can I do with that? For sure. Anything else? So this will, it's up on my GitHub. I haven't written the README, which will have links to htmx.org, a link to, you might not need jQuery and some notes and stuff. I'm very open to being contacted if anybody has questions or wants to dork out. Lots of people here know where to find me.
Put your email later.
Do what?
Put your email out so people can, or some contact information. Show your LinkedIn page or whatever you're comfortable with.
Here's my email. You were going to ask, sorry?
I was going to ask, are there ways to replace visuals and using HTMX?
Yeah, so if you think about the basics of what you're doing, if I have div 1 and I say when I click on that, I want the server response to affect div 2 and replace it. You can write whatever you want to in the Flask app to be put in there, including a raw JavaScript, a raw script tag. You know, with these event callbacks, you can call anything you can write in JavaScript can be called in the life cycle of the event.
Start with, what stood out to me most about this?
Mhm.
This first year student perspective, what made sense to me was, using this tool, you can make it so that almost any element on the page can be in. As you said, including, sorry,
I wouldn't call it a link, but yes, anything on the page can be actionable with user interactions and either JavaScript that is how do I want to put this? You can make something interactive out of anything on the page, regardless of what HTML intended that thing to be in the first place. Now, you can just have links, and they can just work like links and go off to another site. You just don't use HTMX. But you can, and I don't know if there's like, I don't know if there's a hover. You can write a hover event in JavaScript itself. I don't know if this implements that. But with some basic JavaScript in this, you can turn anything on the page into a device for interacting with that page. Yep.
Does that include SVG? I just think this idea of like any tag.
I mean, SVG is legit. It's a legitimate tag. I mean, when they created SVG, they said we're going to make graphics work like HTML. You know, I've dynamically generated SVGs with D3.js before. Not my favorite thing I've ever done. And so I would imagine that manipulating, and I haven't, I've written and then rendered SVGs. I haven't really interacted with them in JavaScript, but I would assume that it's, as long as it's valid-ish markup of some sort, I'm sure it would work. That's an interesting question. Ah. Stephen Hinojosa.
Oh, no.
Oh, he joined.
Someone else.
So I asked a question if it's server side or client side, but the question more is about how performant is HTMX?
Say that again.
How performant is HTML?
My experience, you know, I haven't benchmarked it, but I've been doing web stuff for a long time, and I can tell when something is it's kind of dragging ass. And this has been very performant from what I've seen. You know, I haven't used it in a production environment. I will tell you this: I read an article recently about a company who did a little sort of brainstorming and decided to replace all of the JavaScript in a production app with the exact approach that I'm talking about, HTMX with some light JavaScript. And they have a production app that they replaced jQuery or React. I think it was React, actually. And granted, they had a whole team of engineers, and it wasn't just me, you know, trying to figure this out. But I would imagine that it's a very small file. I would imagine it's pretty performant. They just got accepted into, let's see if this is still there. Somewhere on here, they have a thing that, oh, here it is, the GitHub Open Source Accelerator. So whatever this is, I haven't looked into it, but they're one of these projects that's going to get some money from Google to like do their thing. Oh, there it is. So Google's taking them seriously. Not that that's a, huh?
Is it GitHub or who?
Did I say?
GitHub or Microsoft?
Oh, it's good. I said Google, I meant GitHub. You know, so it's actually been around for a little while. The way I heard about it was ironically a non-practitioner neighbor who's just like interested in tech and threatens to learn it someday. And he's like, starts talking about HTMX, and I'm like, what is that? And he gives me a like pretty professional explanation of what it is. And I'm like, yeah, I'll have to check that out. So I find it to be performant. Again, I haven't formally benchmarked it, but so far so good.
Nice. Any last questions or a round of applause for our speaker?